To start, we have to begin in the city where the car was new. This is 1917, Detroit, and this is a reflection of a perception of what's normal in the city street that we have lost. It is normal for anybody to go more or less wherever they please. Photographs of the time capture this. This is reinforced by the common law tradition that prevailed in city streets before municipal traffic ordinances started to regulate this in the 1920s, namely that the pedestrian is entitled to the free use of the street anywhere, anytime. Judges recognized this. It was upheld. You were not even expected to exercise anything like what we would call due care today. And this is captured in city after city. Here's Minneapolis in 1920. I want you to notice there's actually a traffic officer in the center there, and traffic officer is completely unconcerned with the pedestrians who are roaming around at will. She looks like she's texting or something. It's just like these people are going wherever they want, and this is normal, all right? We have to rediscover normality. We have to question normality and look at alternatives of normality. By 1930, these people were already jaywalkers. In 1920, they were not. This is Philadelphia in 1916, and I wanted to show you this one because here we have children, including a child here, a girl holding her big sister's hand and doing exactly what's considered normal at that time. In fact, you find children playing in the streets all the time, and you don't have to really interpret that this means that streets are for children to play in because people said it. You know, this is a letter to the newspaper saying, well, how are we going to deal with cars? And we can't tell kids not to play in the street because that's what streets are for adults as well. Take a look at this picture. This is showing you the beginning of a clash that would erupt into a major fight, hence the title of the book, Fighting Traffic. It's not just that walking wherever you wanted was okay. It was assumed and expected, and that's reflected in the fact that streetcars were practically always in the middle of the street. And that meant people got off and boarded streetcars in the middle of the street, and that meant pedestrians were expected to walk into the middle of the street all the time, not just at crosswalks. In fact, crosswalks didn't exist when this photograph was taken in Washington, D.C. in 1915. This automobile, however, is beginning to show how this is going to be a complicated problem. The response at that time to this kind of problem is captured in this 1915 letter to an editor in Chicago. Streets are not specially for autoists. You people have to watch out where you're going. Now, it doesn't take a genius to see that you can't mix fast automobiles and slow pedestrians with safety in city streets. And one consequence of this is captured in the statistics of the era. Here you see fatalities hitting the 16,000 mark in 1923. They almost doubled again by 1930. About 30,000 Americans were being killed each year in traffic accidents. This is the really important part. Most of the fatalities were pedestrians. So when people thought of traffic accidents in the 20s, they weren't thinking of people in cars. They were thinking of people walking, many of whom never drove. And this is Philadelphia data from 1928. 3/4 of the people being hit by cars were pedestrians. And now I want you to think about who these pedestrians were. Here they are broken down by age. Look at the 4 to 8 age bar. That 4 to 8 bar graph, that's a 5-year span, is accounting for a substantial fraction of people hit by cars in the city of Philadelphia in 1928. Now, we today would say, what the parents must be completely criminal to let this happen. That's not how it was seen at the time. Rather, the blame was attached to the automobile. The cartoons and newspapers at that time reflect that. Cartoons showing cars striking down innocent kids were all over the newspapers. I saw more of this than I saw Uncle Sam in the iconography of the time. Eric showed you this one from St. Louis. Here's another from New York City. And who was blamed? This safety poster from New York City captures it. It's you who drive. You who drive are the ones who have to avoid this, not the parents. Drivers were condemned as murderers. This cartoon in the lower right, the judge is denouncing this motorist who's depicted in a fur coat representing wealth as a murderer. I have an original typescript letter sent by a father named Barnett Wartell, who lost 2 sons in separate accidents in Philadelphia in 1920 and 1924. His sons were doing what kids were expected to do in the city, which was use the streets freely. They paid with their lives, and Barnett Wartell dealt with his grief through this letter. In another excerpt I won't show you, he calls the people who struck his children murderers. He does not even consider the possibility that as a parent he should have been driving his kids somewhere. He surely didn't have a car. The safety publicity of the time is very poignant in this effect. This is Milwaukee, 1920. And the mother being celebrated here as a mother who's paid the ultimate price in the form of the loss of her son, who is depicted with blood. This is black and white, but it's red blood on this child's playsuit. And the message here is clearly it's not the parent's fault, it's not the child's fault. You can see the giant outsized wheel behind them. In fact, The children who were killed in city streets in America in the 1920s were treated as public losses, not private losses. Take a look at this picture from Baltimore in 1922. It's a poor image, but I think you can barely see them. A man standing giving a speech. He is the mayor of Baltimore. That's public recognition that the children who are memorialized by this obelisk, this is a memorial to the children killed in traffic in Baltimore in 1921, are a public loss, just as we today think of soldiers who die in battle as a public loss, not a private loss like it is today. Here's St. Louis, 1923. These kinds of monuments were in the cities of America, recognizing the magnitude of this catastrophe. Their parents were not blamed, rather they were honored. These are children in Pittsburgh, each one holding up one flower for every child killed by a car in Pittsburgh in 1920. This is New York City. These are the Raquel Nelsons of 1922 in New York City, being honored as White Star mothers, which is the term for a mother who lost a child in war in World War I. These mothers are being honored, not arrested for the loss of their children. Now, there's a practical result that comes from this. You see that in messages like, "Don't let your children play in the street." This poster is interesting because nobody has to tell a mother that today, or a father. But this was a new message at the time, and you start to see the proposal for alternatives like playgrounds. Okay, this is saying we need to keep kids off the street and put them in playgrounds so that this speed maniac can have the free roam of the streets. And you even see it in playground equipment manufacturers who see a chance to make money by selling slides as a way to keep people from being hit by cars because they'll be too busy in the playground to be playing in the street. You see it in new kinds of safety publicity. Look both ways before you cross. This is where this begins. People simply didn't occur to them to look both ways before they crossed before this era, and people were actually learning it. This is a newspaper image, so it's poor, but I think you can see how young these children are that are being instructed to cross a busy street. This is a dutiful mother. We would think of her as irresponsible for sending her children out into the street. They saw the danger not as children in the street, but rather as the speed of motor vehicles. Speed was universally associated with danger, as you can see in these statements from the era and in the safety publicity of the era, which universally condemns speed. Now, in a city that's going to have a future for automobiles, blaming speed is going to be problematic. But this is the pedestrian's perspective. Part of the transition in safety, from viewing safety from the pedestrian's perspective, where speed is the danger, to viewing it from the driver's perspective, where the jaywalker is the danger, a term that was being invented at this time. From the pedestrian's point of view, you have dangers not only of speed, but also of the approach of cars. These are cars approaching pedestrians while they're taking a turn, approaching the pedestrian from the back. Now, this is from a traffic safety expert. This is a traffic safety expert in the 20s taking the pedestrian's point of view. The solution for a corner cut like this was to put a center point in the middle of the intersection with at least a sign and maybe a traffic officer, like this one in Lansing, Michigan. And you would be expected, if you were a motorist, to make a right angle left turn, which in effect makes you practically have to stop. Now, from a motorist point of view, this is a stupid rule. It slows you down. It introduces 2 new crossing points where you're crossing opposing traffic lines. But they weren't stupid. What they were trying to do is make the cars slow down. In an era before radar guns, it was very hard to enforce speed limits. So what they did is they put in rules that were complicated enough to slow the car down. There was no interest in keeping the traffic moving. So if you think of speed as the enemy, the ultimate logical extension would be to make cars incapable of exceeding a low speed limit. I think there was a watershed in the history of the car in the city in America that nobody's heard of that I think is extremely important. In 1923, in Cincinnati, 7,000 Cincinnatians signed petitions to put a referendum on the ballot for a city ordinance that would require all cars in Cincinnati to be equipped with a speed governor that would limit the maximum speed of the car to 25 miles an hour. This could be done under the rules of the city of Cincinnati. 7,000 Cincinnatians backed it. They got this little newspaper ad saying, limit the cars to 25 miles an hour to prevent death. They got a lot of support, but they scared the hell out of people who wanted to sell cars in cities. They pooled together. First, the local people in Cincinnati pooled together. They got a full-page ad saying, no way do we want a speed governor ordinance. You're going to make America like China if you do that. it was going to make Cincinnati a backward place where nobody would come. And all of these people in the boxes on the left were groups that organized to stop it. They're mostly auto dealers, auto clubs, and other local interest groups. But Cincinnati also scared the auto manufacturers of the United States, who were represented in a group at that time called the National Automobile Chamber of Commerce, that got together and said, we're going to have to redefine the safety problem. And you start to see that immediately with this speed governor ordinance. Here's something from automotive industries. Growing accident threat is a threat to the future of the car. We have to redefine safety. Otherwise, the car is going to be hogtied by laws like the Cincinnati Speed Governor Ordinance. The ordinance failed because of this organization. It was soundly defeated in November 1923. But the campaign to change what safety meant in city streets continued. Cincinnati Enquirer got a lot of its money from the auto dealers of Cincinnati, and they began to editorialize about a new explanation for accidents. It was not machines, but they're drivers. It's drivers who make cars dangerous when they hit people, not the car. The car can't be defined as the problem. Otherwise, you're not going to have any cars. You have to pick out a minority of reckless drivers and single them out and punish them so that the rest of people can drive safely with speed. It is a problem, in other words, of reassigning responsibility both to a minority of reckless drivers and also to pedestrians, like this guy, who are walking obliviously across the street. This is a ridiculing depiction of pedestrians. The challenge, according to auto dealers like Charles Hayes of the Chicago Auto Club, was to redefine the street as a place for vehicles to run upon. This would be a commonplace statement today. It was a radical idea. You could, for example, require people to cross at crosswalks. You'd have to paint them. They didn't exist. When they did paint them, nobody paid any attention to them. It's a poor image, but everybody's outside the crosswalk, except for one person by chance. Auto manufacturer George Graham said, we're going to have to educate pedestrians. How do you educate them? Safety campaigns. Everybody loves a safety campaign. Safety's a good thing. We're going to have the automobile dealers and clubs run the safety campaigns. And they're going to have slogans like, don't jaywalk. And we're going to hand out to pedestrians cards like this one, or this one, or this one. These are from 3 different cities. We have Providence, New York City, and Hartford. These 3 different cities here were all recruiting Boy Scouts, because they're free. You could give them a little merit badge or something. And the Boy Scout would give pedestrians these cards every time they crossed anywhere but at the crosswalk. Now, in the newspaper story in the top left, you read that a lot of people had no idea what these cards were about, didn't know they were jaywalking, never heard of it before. There was one young couple in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where the story on the top left is from, that actually deliberately collected as many cards as they could. This was a completely alien idea. They'd never heard of jaywalking. You can tell that they didn't know what jaywalking is because these cards, like the one on the top right, very carefully describe what jaywalking is. Pedestrians needed education, and the industry journals of the time, like automotive industries, recognized that we're going to have to educate pedestrians. How? Well, a genius in Los Angeles named E.B. Lefferts, head of the auto club there, figured out that you don't educate them by, say, giving them tickets so much as you do by ridiculing them. He said the ridicule of their fellow citizens is the way to do it because nobody can stand ridicule. He called this applied psychology. And he applied it in Los Angeles to great effect. They funded a safety campaign in Los Angeles that attracted ridicule to jaywalkers, and they were cartooned in the newspapers. And you find this in the most ingenious safety campaigns you'll ever see. Safety campaigns that had people dressed up in ridiculous costumes with signs saying, I'm a jaywalker, aren't I an idiot? And they would cross streets anywhere and attract ridicule and then collect a paycheck from the local auto club. These are men dressed up as women. They're clowns representing jaywalkers. They're supposed to look ridiculous to make jaywalking look ridiculous. Here's a clown in New York City getting rear-ended by a Model T to the amusement of a crowd in the background who are laughing and silently thinking, wow, I never want to be a jaywalker now because, you look like a complete idiot if you do it. Lefferts sponsored through the Auto Club an ordinance in Los Angeles, which then got a no jaywalking law. The sign on the top says jaywalking prohibited by order of the police department, but right below it is the seal of the people who paid for the signs, the Auto Club of Southern California. And Amazingly, by 1924, a word that just a decade before was basically unknown was entered for the first time into a dictionary, and jaywalker had become a word. There was some pushback. There was a guy who wrote a letter to the newspaper in St. Louis who said we should talk about jay drivers. And some of the newspaper cartoons were sympathetic to the jaywalker, like this one by Winsor McCay, a famous cartoonist of the time, from 1925, which depicts the jaywalking pedestrians as innocent and the drivers as obnoxious. But this is now the minority view. By 1930, the majority view was, streets are for cars. Now, that's how you reach adults. They had to reach the children, too. And Motor Age, an industry journal, recognized this. Auto Club of Southern California was again a leader. They had children do artwork. They would give them the slogan, and then the children would draw art. So this is an Auto Club slogan with a 6th grader's artwork explaining why you shouldn't go in the street. Here's a coloring book from 1925, and it actually says right there, the street is for autos. I learned that coloring books in the 20s, you were not supposed to be imaginative. You were supposed to look at the model and then mindlessly copy it down here. That was news to me about coloring books. But every time you looked to see what color you were supposed to use and then went down to color, your eyes passed over this message: the street is for autos. And that was the point. Now, one way to get kids to do the right thing in streets from this point of view was to give them responsibility. This is the beginning of the era of school safety patrols. The first ones were not sponsored by auto clubs. In the middle there is a safety patrol with a red flag. He's actually stopping traffic. They could direct traffic. In other words, the kids still had some priority use of the streets. AAA and local auto clubs took over all of the school safety patrols in the 20s. I was at their archive in Heathrow, Florida some years ago, and they said they invented safety patrols. Actually, they took them over, and here, this captures their message. They had the school safety patrols stand on the street corner and wait until there was no traffic, what I used to do when I was a school safety patrol in the mid-70s. And American Automobile Association became the national leader in school safety curricula. They were offered every public school in the United States free safety curricula that included messages like, I resolve to cross streets carefully, you sign the pledge, and you become a dutiful citizen who knows that streets are for cars, you obey the traffic officer. This is another AAA poster. Now, besides safety, there's also the congestion angle, and this is another way in which the streets were redefined. Traffic congestion wasn't just a problem today. It was a problem in the 1920s. This photograph from Chicago captures it well. This is 1920s traffic congestion. Now, the solution for most of the 20th century would be to increase capacity. That was not the solution in the 1920s. The solution they called traffic control. This is the most famous book on that subject from the 20s, Miller McClintock's Traffic Control. The message was, get more efficient use of existing facilities. Don't expand them. It doesn't make sense. Efficiency was the message. With scientific organization, you could cut traffic in half. What did that mean? Well, it meant, for example, timing traffic signals with slide rules like this so that drivers could get green lights, and that would increase traffic capacity. It also meant that cars were going faster, which made it harder on pedestrians. But it didn't mean that you had to supply new street space. That was not the solution. If you look at this same street that you saw a minute ago, before the traffic control people got a hold of it, it's chaos. The traffic control people looked at this and said, all right, get rid of the curb parking, time the traffic signals optimally, and you'll get some real results. And they did. This is a picture taken on the same day of the week at the same time of day after a ban on curb parking and optimized timing of traffic signals. Now, from a pedestrian's point of view, this is actually worse because the cars are going faster, it's harder to cross. But it does at least supply more capacity without building more traffic surface space. Now, this solution was incidentally one that the street railways happened to applaud. They said, we're the people who are really efficient users of street space. And this sort of advertisement was all over the place in the 1920s. Street railways said, we're the ones who use street space well. And you actually see comparative pictures at the top of the right-hand advertisement that compares the efficiency in street space usage of automobiles versus streetcars and buses. This is a technique that was rediscovered in the late 20th century. You may have seen pictures like this that show the number of cars compared to the number of people if they were just sitting in chairs, or the number of people who could be bicycling, or on the left you see a bus, and on the right the number of people and the street space they occupy. This is an efficiency message. Now, efficiency was not going to deliver a future for cars in cities. Why? Well, I don't have to tell you all that cars are not an efficient use of limited, scarce, valuable street space. That's a message you'll hear over and over again at this convention. So an alternative besides spatial efficiency was needed to supply a space for cars and streets. This became quite urgent in the early 20s for two reasons. One is cars were being blamed for injuries and fatalities, which was one limitation on their future. Another was that there was a sudden drop in sales of cars in 1922. The industry was looking for a reason to explain what was going wrong. And they said people in cities aren't buying cars because the traffic jams are so bad. So they said we're going to have to figure out a different way to deal with congestion. Engineering News Record, the leading journal for civil engineers then and now, came up with the solution. They said we're going to have to redefine what a city street is for. This was already happening because the school safety education, the jaywalking campaigns were redefining a city street from a place for everybody to a place specifically for cars. But this was going to have to go further, especially to deal with the congestion problem. The really ingenious element, besides jaywalking and school safety education, the third element was the gasoline tax. Gasoline tax was first introduced at the state level in Oregon in 1919. Automobile industry groups of all kinds denounced it, hated it, called it fleecing of motorists, they called it punitive. They called it every bad name you could think of until 1923 when they said, look, we just had a slump in sales. It's because there's not enough street capacity. What if we told the legislatures of the states of the United States, all right, pass a gas tax, we'll support it on one condition, and that is that every dollar go to supplying street capacity. In 1923, 4 states had a gasoline tax. In 1925, 44 states had it because the auto industry completely changed their perspective. They said with gasoline taxes, we can fund infrastructure like this, which will solve congestion for cars. It will solve the safety problem because pedestrians won't be allowed on here. It'll solve the safety problem for car-to-car accidents because we're going to separate the grades so the cars don't have conflicting paths of travel. And it's going to cost a lot of money, but we're going to pay for it. And not only that, once we pay for it, we get to say streets are for cars because we paid for them. Damn it, so they're ours. So another way of looking at this, though, was to say that this is a very American solution because it's giving us freedom. And that freedom became the wonderful alternative to efficiency. Efficiency didn't serve this mission. Freedom did. You see that captured in this statement from an auto dealer in 1924. The car is a means for serving freedom. With gasoline tax, they were actually able to build some of these things. This is the world's first fully functional cloverleaf. This is Woodbridge, New Jersey, 1929, right across the Arthur Kill from Staten Island. This is the motor age solution. The automobile industry and other interest groups connected with it organized in the 20s. When they did, they called themselves Organized Motordom. That was their name for themselves, sometimes just Motordom, to change prevailing understandings of safety, of pedestrianism, and of congestion. And these are the solutions. This would make it okay to go fast, as Ray Sherman put it in 1935. We can go fast on these things. We won't have any traffic lights. There won't be any pedestrians to kill. It's going to make speed and safety compatible. Shell Oil Company liked this message. They put together this vision of the future. In 1935, this model was built by a stage designer named Norman Bell Geddes. He helped design the General Motors Futurama exhibit. They managed to get the traffic control efficiency people on board with it because they paid them to. On the left, you see Miller McClintock, the former disciple of efficiency, who's now a champion of automobile freedom for the automobile age, and the stage designer Norman Bell Geddes on the right, who put together this book called Magic Motorways. They were magic because they were going to make it possible to go as fast as you wanted with perfect safety anywhere you wanted. This is a Shell ad for their vision of the future city. This model became the core of the famous 1939 World's Fair exhibit by General Motors called the Futurama, which, as you can see, depicts a future with cars all over the place. The voice that narrated visitors to the exhibit told them that 1/3 of the city would be parks. Actual overhead shots tend to show about 1/3 of the city as parking lots because all these cars have to stop somewhere. And this was a vision in 1939 after World War II. As Charles Hayes of the Chicago Motor Club said, this is going to be what we'll do to the cities of America. Hence we get, as I think you all know, the destruction of American cities for cars. This is Boston in 1959. And I want to conclude by reminding you of the explanation for why it's okay to destroy our own cities for the sake of the car. It's because we have a love affair with the car. And love affairs are not fundamentally explainable in rational terms. We will do anything for that special person we love. Now, I'm going to guess that most of you heard of the love affair thesis before. In 1961, there was an NBC TV program on once a week called the DuPont Show of the Week. It was sponsored mostly by General Motors, which DuPont incidentally owned a one-third share of General Motors. And they had a once-a-week nonfiction story hosted by a celebrity. It would be a sort of documentary. And it shows a wonderful appreciation for the importance of history, because DuPont and General Motors recognized that if we're going to say that this is actually a smart thing to do, we're going to need a history that explains it. They put together a show in 1961 called Merrily We Roll Along. It was as their host Groucho Marx, who you see on the right, and he told the history of the car. And the story was, Americans love their cars and will do anything for them, and therefore, no matter what we do to America's cities, it's in the name of love. And in the show, he uses expressions like this over and over again. Now, one thing that's been lost in the metaphor was that the way Groucho used it in 1961, there was a gender angle to this. In other words, the American driver was a man and the car was a woman. And that's how he put it. The car was the new girl in town. And there's a certain sexuality about the metaphor that I'll let you work out. And this relatively long excerpt really captures it. You can't get along with her. You can't get along with her. You can't get, it's like something Milton Berle would have said, right? And this is the message. We have to have our cars. We'll do anything for them. And it was such a successful program that this metaphor entered into the vocabulary. In other words, I mean, you can do word searches now, as you know, of digitized newspapers. The phrase Americans' love affair with the automobile didn't exist until this program. And after that, it was used not only by automobile promoters, but by their critics as well, as if the term was a naturally evolved concept that came out of the soil. It wasn't. It was invented in 1961. It's still used in 2012 by scholars who seem to imagine that it's an organic expression that emerged from the grassroots rather than an invention like it was, something to justify the city we know and love today, which looks something like this.